All right, folks, thanks again for joining us to this episode of Data Security Decoded. My name's Steve Stone from Rubrik Zero Labs. This series has always been focused on threats to data, how we think about risks to data, and primarily with a view of how senior leaders tackle those challenges. Based on that criteria, I'm really excited for today's guest. We're thrilled to welcome Sue Bergamo to today's episode of Data Security Decoded. She currently serves as both the CISO and the CIO at BTE Partners, where she leverages her past experience in cybersecurity, compliance, and technology, driving both strategic and operational excellence. She has an extensive background, including pivotal roles like the VP of Global Information Security at ActiveCampaign, the Global CISO at Precisely, where she was instrumental in building robust security frameworks from the ground up, and then a range of deep technical roles as well. Sue brings this unique dual perspective as both CIO and CISO, and the insights into technology and cybersecurity strategy, and really how to do that at a global scale. Her experience ranges from hands-on technical roles at Microsoft to multiple executive leadership positions, and this really gives her invaluable knowledge on navigating cyber threats, implementing effective defensive mechanisms, and really how to think and communicate about this at the executive level in particular. Also, her commitment to fostering diversity in the tech community and mentoring the next generation of professionals really makes her an aspiring figure and a really valuable voice in that ongoing conversation that we try to have around data security and the people that execute that for us. So I'll kind of pause there and say, welcome, Sue. Thanks for joining our program.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here today. Data security is a hot topic, always has been, and I'm thrilled to give the audience some of my expertise.
Well, I would love to just jump into it. I've got more questions than we can possibly cover in a single episode. So I want to kind of start off with, really the most basic question, which is, you've had a remarkable journey across cybersecurity and technology. I think it's really interesting that you've done this both as cybersecurity and in other roles. I'd be interested if you could really start at the beginning. What drew you to this field, and why have you really maintained a passion for this and been willing to take on so many roles in this space?
That's a great question. So I've had a very long career, but it's been a terrific one. I'll shorten it up a little bit. I started at the ground floor and literally as a system administrator, stringing cables and slinging, disk drives when, we actually literally had to crawl into the disk, the little disk drives. They were like front loader washers. It was amazing, but dating myself. But I just kept raising my hand and taking on opportunities when no one else wanted to. And when I started my career, everyone had a niche skill. And I said, I don't want to do that because technology was really, coming into the forefront, and I just wanted to learn. So I found myself as a CIO, kind of spilling forward fast, which, I was for 12 years. And you never really lose it. But about 2013, I always had security in my shop, but it really, really started to move forward and get hot. And I said, okay, this is going to be the next pivot. And I went back to school, got a master's in cyber with a concentration in cyber and a minor in international terrorism. And the rest is kind of history. So, yeah. I like to look at terrorism on the sidelines. It's kind of fun and horrifying, thing that I do on the weekends and nights. So yeah, it's cool.
I love what you just kind of mentioned. There's two kind of fascinating things to me personally. First, I love the context of how much this has changed and, working with devices that are the equivalent size of washers. I remember in one of my first cyber jobs, we were using floppy disks. That sounds insane now, but it's how much things have changed. And then you mentioned starting with cyber and working working into terrorism. My background was the opposite. I started in terrorism and worked into cyber. So I love that about this space, just how diverse the roles and paths are. So as I think about that, and you've had just a wide range of roles from technical architecture at Microsoft to multiple global cybersecurity leadership roles. As you look back, what do you see as some of the major milestones that shifted your career? And really specifically, how has that shifted your approach to leadership specifically?
I think my answer is going to be threefold. One, the technology changes rapidly. I'll go back to that in a second. The processes, compliance, regulatory changes. And then third, the people, not just employees, but the threat actors. It's a constant juggle. No 2 days are ever alike. No two threats are ever alike. And, once these cyber criminals really started taking the forefront, early on when the industry started to get hot, we'd have one every now and then, but now it's a constant threat. And so when you look at the landscape and the attack surfaces that we're defending, every single day, it just no 2 days are alike. So it's an exciting place to be, and it's also a very critical role for every single company out there. And cyber teams really don't get a lot of fanfare and accolades.
It's interesting that you mentioned just how the tempo has increased. I was just talking with someone this week at a CISO event where it wasn't that long ago that a really quality cyber threat analyst could talk about every single O day that was used that year. That's insane now. Like you can't even know all of them for the last 60 days. It's just that's how much that tempo has picked up. If I could pull the thread on one thing you mentioned, you talk about global. In my own experience, one of the toughest things is managing and leading at the global level because there's so many competing priorities, especially with security and business in particular. I'd be really interested if you could talk about your experience with that and if there's a specific instance or two where you saw aligning those competing strategies and goals and international challenges led to some either unexpected benefits or challenges. I know that's very open ended, but I would love your take on that.
Well, I've been fortunate to work for global companies that had a common mission. It's not like I've worked for companies that have had a multitude of subsidiaries that are all doing something differently. That makes it a little harder. But with a common mission and goal, and with a good cyber program, you can actually defend against the issues that are out there. Now, that doesn't mean that a specific geographic location isn't going to be hit with some sort of cyber threat or cyber attack. But if you have global SecOps, security operations, looking around and making sure that your threat landscape is not on fire, it makes my job a little bit easier. So I kind of use a measurement of when I walk into a company, and this is just a quickie little measurement that I do, but I call it the hair on fire. If your hair is on fire and your team's hair is on fire, it means that they don't have a good security program. And then you work to fix that. In security, and this is, we can get into this, but this is sort of where we do ourselves harm. When everything is calm, cool, and collected, which it should be, right? That's what the norm should be. Everybody thinks that everything's okay. And it's not in the back end. It's just that we have this facade in the front of us that says, we got a handle on it. Things are really good. So I use that also. It doesn't matter if it's domestic or globally. You still have to have that facade going. People don't really necessarily need to understand the firefighting that's happening 24/7 on the back end. They just need to know that things are good, things are calm, and then we talk about the one that gets through every now and then.
I definitely would like to dive into that a little bit because I think you've got such a unique perspective and just what you mentioned there, that hair on fire, that crisis. That's really how I grew up in cyber. My background is in bad guys and breaches. And as I've spent time here at Rubrik focusing on threats to data, risks to data, that experience definitely helps on the security side. And I've had to learn a different set of skills dealing with IT teams and DevOps and cloud and things more traditionally on the CIO side of the house. And that hasn't been easy. Those are very different worlds in some ways. And so you have a dual role as a CISO and CIO. You've done both individually before. I'd be really curious how you balance the operational needs of IT and those cultures, and then the real demands with cybersecurity and those cultures. How do you pick sides? How do you balance that doing both at the same time?
You don't pick sides. You can't. You have to be everywhere all at once. It's a really, this isn't a job that is really for the faint of heart. And if people can't multitask or understand the triad that CISOs abide by, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability, like that's what our jobs are. There's other things that go along with that, but that's what we strive for every single day. Keep data information protected. Make sure that it's the right data, that it's got integrity, and that it's available for use by the right people at the right time. So you can't pick sides. You have to be everywhere. Now, some of our jobs are very specific. Um, some people just do compliance. Some people just do tech. Some people are there for the infrastructure of the DevOps team or for the engineering team. So it really depends on the company that you're working for and what it is that they actually want you to do. I've been fortunate that the companies that I've worked for want me to do everything. So I just, split little pieces of myself and I have my priorities, which everybody, agrees with. But then when an event happens or an incident occurs, incident being breach, it's all hands on deck and you don't get to pick and choose. You just get to defend. So the other thing that I like to talk about is that, from a CISO perspective, we're all about the game and the challenge of playing with those cyber criminals. Like we are competitive in nature, and it's us against them, and we want to win. So that's really where that, where I said before, that hair on fire comment is when things are quiet, we could be getting hit all day long, all night long in the back end, but you'd never notice it on the front end. We're calm, cool, collected, and we've got our proverbial what together through incident response plans and communication plans, and we know exactly what we're going to do when we're going to do it, and our teams are trained to do the same thing. So there's no picking sides. You're just there for everybody.
I found in my own experience, very much what you're saying, there's this interesting balance, and I'll speak in very general terms, which is always dangerous, but the security side of the house is fairly used to crisis. They're fairly used to jumping in and tackling new problems. And then, honestly can struggle some at the long-term strategic piece because you're always in the daily fight. And then on the more traditional CIO side of the house, those experts tend to be really great at long-term planning, really great at keeping things up and moving. And there's some lessons to be learned on that side of the house around, like, we've got a crisis, we've got a problem outside of the norm, not just we're used to misconfigurations, but now we've got a new challenge. And so I'd be curious if you've encountered that in your experience, if you think our experiences are different or the same, and how you've been able to manage potentially some of those inherent tensions between long term, short term, and different views on that.
You know, when you have a dual role, you have to stay on target, right? So you have, like, if you have a strategic plan that you're following that plan. Let's just, for ease of use, say, you're developing or implementing an ERP, right? A lot of companies are still doing that, or a CRM, a big ticket item. So as, as a dual CIO CISO, when security rears its head, you may get off track, off that target for a period of time, but you keep it going. And hopefully you've got a good team in place who's keeping it going. So you're always being pushed at all sides, but you have to stay on that target. The other thing too is that, again, some of us, well, let's talk a little bit about why this role of CISO occurred, right? And so the CIO, and I do hang around a lot of CIOs and CISOs, um, they were busy, right? And so the CIO position evolved and they finally came out of that tunnel, and they were, the evolution basically took them into the back office. They're I don't want to call them project managers, but they either focus on internal applications or the internal infrastructure, or both. And security became such a big item that the CIO really couldn't handle it themselves. And they started asking for people like me to take the security piece of their shop, and to do with it, create the programs and then implement the programs. That's why the CISO position occurred. And you'll hear there's a lot of us that talk about this role. You can just go Google us anytime you want. But we we really believe that with the evolution of the CISO right now, because we're kind of going through the same thing as the CIO did, nobody really knows what to do with the CISO right now. They know we're needed. They're not quite sure why they need us, especially if you sort of use that rule of thumb. Your hair's not on fire. Everything seems to be calm, cool, and collected. Gee, we're not getting breached, right? And so the C-level staff is questioning the CISO role, right? And now, with the SEC cyber disclosure role, many of us are leaving our roles. Um, so we're going through an evolution. We'd love to see the CIO take it back, and many of us could be CIOs because we understand what it takes to not only secure an environment but also to manage initiatives. But there's an evolution going here, and honestly, I could talk about this all day long. I feel like I do talk about it all day long, and I hope that at the end of this tunnel, we're going to come out and we're going to be in a much better place. But a lot of CISOs have a misconception. I don't think we're ever going to report to the board. I hate to say that out loud. The CIO does report to the executive team and a lot of times has a seat at the board, or at least reports into the board on a monthly or quarterly basis. I'd at least like to see the CISO as a peer. If the CIO is not gonna take us back, and the CTO really doesn't want us either, then make us a peer. Don't let us report to either one of those individuals. Put us maybe under legal or risk, because I doubt the CEO is ever going to make us a direct report, and invite us to the board meeting. This part of the conversation is not going to win me a lot of friends in the CISO world, but I'm looking for alternatives because the board isn't interested in having us report into them. And the SEC cyber disclosure rules stop short of asking the board to take us on.
I think that unpopular opinion is absolutely right. And one of the things that we see over and over again is there's this almost bifurcated discussion between what people think CISO should end up being and then the reality. And the reality is the CISO role has been around for a while. It didn't just show up yesterday. So I think you're very much on target there. I really do, from, again, my own optic of, if it was going to be this thing that everyone's recommending, it would have happened, and it hasn't. And I think there's a really important, I hate to say reality around that because that sounds very negative and harsh, but I think if we're going to be effective on the security side, we have to get our arms around this and really think about what it means. And very much in that vein, probably one of the questions I wanted to get into the most, and I'm very thankful you threw me a couple of bones there for a transition, is around regulations. At Rubrik, we deal with nothing but data. My job specifically is risks to data. And so it's inevitable that we're talking about regulations. You can't deal with data and you're not going to be heavily regulated, deal with a lot of legal issues, rightfully so. I think those things are really appropriate. So I don't want it to come across in a negative way. But as we look at that, and specifically the new SEC regulations you're mentioning, and the two parts around disclosure timeframes, and also let's call it steady state reporting, and the ability to say that organizations will now really be held accountable for what they report. I hear a lot of trepidation from CISOs around this. I think a lot of people agree these are good in the abstract, but I hear a lot of personal concern from the people that are now responsible for this. What do you see as the impacts from these new SEC regulations?
Oh, that is a loaded question. So I belong to a lot of CISO communities. Many of us on the more experienced side, and I say that very specifically. There are CISOs out there that are not as experienced as some of us are, but the more experienced ones who understand what's happening here in the landscape of regulatory and compliance are leaving our jobs, and we're doing it very specifically. Um, we need to have insurance to cover us, directors and officers, and errors in omission, and some companies don't want to give that. So if we leave our organizations because we don't want to be, not that we don't want to be held responsible, no, none of us want to go to jail, and we're still waiting to see who's going to be the first person to go. But if we become contractors, virtual or fractional retained CISOs, we can have our own insurance, right? Which covers us, which some companies don't want to do. There are 2 cases right now of CISOs that have been charged with felonies. One already had been sentenced and got away relatively easy, no jail time. The second one is still pending trial. We're all watching that, and a lot of us participate in the abacus brief, which is we're writing, to the government and saying, please, please don't do this. We don't want to go to jail. And the other thing is we're standing alone. In the first case, that CISO stood alone in front of a judge for sentencing. And if you look at the court case for Joe Sullivan, the judge asked him why he was standing there alone. So the SEC disclosure rule, cyber disclosure rule, said that the C-level, the board, needed to be aware of cybersecurity. They didn't say they needed to be responsible, and the board's typically not necessarily responsible, but that C-suite is responsible along with us. And the thing with the CISOs is when a material breach occurs, we do exactly what we're supposed to do. We get in a room with general counsel, filed under attorney-client privilege, and we talk about what happened at an in-depth level. A lot of times we have that conversation alone, right? Because it's attorney-client privilege. And then they go off and they go inform probably the CEO. There may be others involved, but like the head of marketing or sales is never going to be in that conversation. And then we may get brought in. Sometimes we don't, but we're typically told by general counsel exactly what we should be saying and not saying. And so, the SEC now wants us, let me back up before I say this next statement. They say that, a disclosure needs to be made, but the CISO never makes that decision, ever, right? And so now they're saying if the disclosure doesn't occur, that we, the CISO, should use the whistleblower rule. So either way, and I hate to say it like this, we're screwed, right? So we're leaving, and we're going to continue to fight this SEC disclosure rule, not because it isn't the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do, the 4-day rule, but we want coverage and we want to know that we're not standing alone because we're not going to jail for any company that makes the decision not to disclose when it's the right thing to do. So, there's a lot of things that are going on. Okay, let me go back to regulatory, right? Because that was the other thing that you asked about. In the European Union, they've made life a little easier for us because at least, there's 12 states, 12 geographic locations that are using GDPR. And even though the UK left in Brexit, they still continue to adopt GDPR-like regulatory stance. Thank God, right? It was a little easier to do. In the United States, and even the DORA rule, which is more focused on financial disclosures and financial risk management, falls in line really with the SEC cyber disclosure rule. And so with the SEC, 4 days for disclosure, but in the United States, we have, I've lost count, but I think it's like 38 separate states who are doing their own data privacy. So yeah, this is very confusing for us, right, for us as CISOs. But here's what I do, and this is a tidbit for your audience. I always solve for the highest level regulatory or compliance issue. And in my world, in security, it's ISO 27001, and that's not regulatory. That's more on the compliance framework, security framework side. And then on the regulatory, I solve for GDPR. Everything falls underneath that. And so I watch, because you can't be up and down, oh, it's 2 days here, it's a week there, right, for disclosure. So just follow one rule. It's a little easier. You won't make yourself crazy. And then I follow those frameworks and compliance regulatory issues, and then I add to it. So like my GDPR right now is plus CCPA for California, right? And so, but I still want to solve within 3 days. And that, keeps me within the guidelines of the SEC cyber disclosure rule. And let's talk about that disclosure because there's a lot of 8Ks being filed right now. These people don't know what to do, but they know they need to file them. It's pretty clear that within 3 days or 4 days, you may not know what's going on. Some breaches are very quick. They only take a couple of hours. Some breaches could go on for months, right? And so you don't really know, but you know that something has occurred and you can at least have preliminary information on the material incident, right? And material means data has been breached, has been exfiltrated. Or changed, or something with your data has occurred. So, you just need to understand that if you file your 8K, if you're a publicly held company, you're going to have some preliminary information. You can always go back and continue to revise that information until you really have forensics completed and you know exactly what's occurred. So that'll keep you out of trouble with the government. And keep you aligned to the regulatory issue that's before us.
There's so much gold in what you just said, and I think the last piece, particular on time frame, I think is so underrated. And again, in just my own experience, over multiple organizations supporting or being involved in hundreds and hundreds of breaches, I've yet to see one where the initial assessment of the impact was the same as the final assessment. That's just not how it works. So that's a real challenge. And I think it's really important because I think there's this perception that a bad thing happens and the defenders know exactly what it is. And that just has never happened in my own experience. I've seen it exactly 0 times. I could ask you 100 questions on everything you just said, but I'd like to kind of cage myself to 2 because there's another topic I would really, really like to dive into with you. But the first of the 2 is you mentioned compliance and the difference between compliance and regulatory. And we've talked about what I think is fair to say are contentious new regulatory pressures on leaders. I'd be curious in your experiences on either the CIO or CISO side. Have you seen the opposite? Do you see a compliance or regulatory initiative that you think has really made a significant improvement on raising the tide for organizations?
Well, I'm going to say this, which again isn't going to earn me a lot of gravy points or brownie points, whichever way you want to look at it. But I do think that these regulatory, guidelines, if that's what we want to call them, they're laws. They are helpful, right? They do make companies accountable, responsible, right? And, if you're being trusted with your customers' data, then you should put your best foot forward to protect that information. Now, I'll talk about the United States. I wish we could just get it together and come up with our own GDPR because it would make life a lot easier. So California has the whole cookie rule with, CCPA, but not any other, state does. And again, the disclosure goes everything from 3 days to, 60 days, I think it is. Let's get it together and make our lives a little easier. It's not like the government's following up on this stuff, as quickly as we get it to them. So, let's just come up with something that makes sense for everyone. And then companies won't have such a hard time understanding what it is that they need to do from a compliance perspective. I was saying before about CISOs leaving their roles and what's happening here, which ties into this compliance thing. The C-level is saying, oh, okay, I'm going to hire SecOps managers. I'm going to promote them not into the CISO role, but I'm going to give them the head of security because the SEC disclosure rule talked about incident response, right? So, they're thinking security operations. So security operations managers are a talented group of individuals, and they really and truly understand how to define an incident. And what I mean by that is they're very good at identifying where things happened, how they happened. But they are not CISOs and they don't understand compliance. They also don't understand how to put together a security program because that's not their talent. And they are extremely talented individuals. So I see this convergence happening, or it will be a convergence at some point in the future And we now have individuals sitting in the head of security seat who don't understand the true threat landscape, which includes compliance, regulatory, and all these frameworks that they need to coexist in. And I do think that the cyber criminals are watching what's happening here, and it's going to be a field game pretty soon. That's my prediction for the future.
Sue, I swear you can see the notes I'm writing here as you're
I
mentioning things,
can't.
because that was going to be my second question. Is this there's this confluence of to kind of bridge your most recent comment with one of the very first ones you made about established CISOs now looking at returning to being CIOs because of these pressures. But then there is this, let's call it the next generation or whatever the right term is. And I totally agree. This a young CISO, let's call it the young
Yeah.
CISOs are coming primarily out of SecOps and SOCs and IR worlds. And they're very different personas than the original CISOs, that kind of first generation. And so as I look at that, I'm curious on your take on my opinion. My opinion is I see two types of CISOs that are now having to tackle these regulatory and frankly career and livelihood issues in two very different ways. The established CISOs are, in my experience, doing exactly what you're saying. They're looking at returning to traditional IT, CIO, cloud roles, data officer, a range of things that are available to those professionals. And then you have these emerging CISOs that this is it. This is kind of their big move, and they don't have a fallback plan to an equivalent position. So they've really got to ride out the CISO thing. And I'd be interested, one, if you think I'm wrong on that, or if you think that's tracking with your experience. And two, what advice would you give these emerging CISOs that might not have the options and experience of these legacy CISOs, again, for lack of a better term?
Okay. So I see a lot of inexperienced young CISOs losing their jobs even before they get started because they don't understand. And again, it's the triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. They don't understand how to get that together because they don't have the background or the experience. Their experience is in understanding where the alert came from, right? And breaking that alert down. And that's a talent that is needed, but it does not complete a security program. The advice that I have, I'm going to do a shameless plug. I just wrote a book on how to become a CISO. So go find me on Amazon. It's called So You Want to Become a CISO. It tells you everything you want to know, right? But this is a real problem in the industry. And I'm very concerned about the young ones. Look, if they get promoted, good for them, right? Seek a mentor, right? Go learn everything that you can learn because the role is very diverse. And those of us that aren't just given one thing to do, like AppSec or DevOps, pick one path, right? Those that don't understand that, they're at a disadvantage. And a lot of young CISOs believe that if they just bring in the tech and they're monitoring, right, for those alerts, then things are good, right? But that's not what it's about. And, you know, the tech is only one piece of it. There's vulnerabilities, right? Like that leads into AppSec. So if you only have an infrastructure background and then you get into AppSec, you're lost, right? Same thing goes the other way around. Or what if you're responsible for SecOps and you've never done it before? Or you've got fraud or physical security, or you're just a compliance and risk CISO and you're now thrown into one of the other things that I just mentioned. You are lost. And so it takes an experienced CISO to really put together a good program. So if you don't want to buy my book, then go find someone to mentor you and ask questions because your job is at stake and they are losing them, unfortunately.
I think it's great that even there's a book. I mean, I think we've both been doing this long enough where we've had to figure things out the hard way. So the fact that there's an actual guide now is great, and I commend you full hearted for that because I would have loved to have had those references along the way. So I've just got to ask you on one last major topic, and it will be somewhat of a hard pivot, but it's something that I think you're pretty passionate about as I am as an individual, and our company at Rubrik is around diversity in tech. You've been a vocal advocate for diversity. I'm a very large proponent of it, and I think for me, it's a very practical thing. We've got a talent shortage. We have to deal with crisis. We have to deal with lots of things that we haven't learned before. And I see diversity. Diversity is a tool to solve these very real problems we have. And I think there's this strange dichotomy where DEI can be a controversial word now. Diversity can be received in different ways. I'd be really interested to hear, how do you, in your experience, believe diversity within particularly cybersecurity and IT changes the risk and resiliency of organizations?
Well, I'm going to give you a visual. So, this is my management style, right? Everybody brings a skill, expertise, culture, diversity to the table. No two people can be alike, but you should cross train people because at some point somebody's not going to be there, right? For whatever reason. So, being a global CIO and CISO, I have diverse candidates, right, in my shop from all different flavors and cultures around the world. And I love that because no two people think alike. And you don't want people to think alike. You want people to stand out for themselves, especially when they're fighting an incident, right? You need people who can dig deep and figure it out. But I am going to disagree with something you just said. I don't believe that there's a talent shortage. I think that there are weird or broken processes in the marketplace right now. I could give you, in anyone in your audience, if you're looking for talent, please contact me, link with me, because I have people at all levels who are desperate to find roles, who are desperate to get out of the crappy companies that they're working for and can't find positions. They're either ghosted, they're applying for roles. Everybody wants, if there's 10 check boxes, you got to have 11, or, there's like no organic growth. And I have people that are diverse. I have people who, are, I guess, should I say not diverse? I mean, what's not diverse anymore, right? Like women, men, all different cultures. You know, there are people out there looking for roles, but something's broken in the industry right now. But I don't think that it's talent, because there is talent there. It's just finding the roles that people aren't hiring for, but they're out there and people are applying for them. So, but diversity's key. Diversity's key in thinking about security and defending our companies against cyber attacks.
I could not be happier for the course correction, because I think you're absolutely right. I could have definitely addressed that better. So I definitely am appreciative of that. One thing I'd be curious to take this one level lower is the ways to actually do this. There was this really fascinating discussion we were having internal to Rubrik. We have a senior engineering leader in our team named April Fallon. And she was talking about, if you want to really have diverse teams, and particularly around women and underrepresented communities, her guidance to our leadership was, you have to make this financially viable. This has to be about equity. This has to be about pay, because that creates resilient employees, which creates powerful employees. And I thought her discussion around practical, tangible ways to foster powerful, diverse teams, it really stuck with me. And this is clearly something that you care about and have a lot of experience on. Is there any kind of experience that you have for creating these long-term diverse teams that I could steal from you, just like I stole from April? I would love to kind of hear what's worked for you.
What's worked for me is treating people with kindness and respect. So it doesn't matter who says something on your team, listen to them and give everyone the ability to have a voice. On my LinkedIn profile just earlier this week, I posted research by Women in Cyber that basically said women are being excluded in cyber, right? Which, yes, it's happening. And just look at go out there and look at the thread. It's horrifying. So for every man who's in cyber, either at the CISO level or at a different level, make sure that the women in your teams are being given an opportunity to speak, right? Because a lot of women just get fed up sometimes and then they just put their heads down and they don't say anything. But it's the quiet ones you want to hear from. And if you've got somebody who's shutting everyone down, shut them down for a moment and give the quiet ones, male or female, doesn't matter, an opportunity to say something and contribute, because those people are just as smart as the other ones on your team. You wouldn't have hired them if they weren't. And everyone should have a say, no matter what. And one of the things that I'm just going to give you an example, but one of the things I love to do is these tabletop exercises. And I always take a volunteer to put together the exercise, and then they lead it, right? So it's a different person every time. They lead it. And then I say, management's not available. Let's see who's going to shine. Let's see who's going to rise to the occasion and figure out what to do. Because again, no two people are going to think alike, and you want that creativity when an incident is occurring. So give everybody a chance to have a voice.
In my own experience, that creativity has solved virtually every problem. These are hard challenges that are dynamic, and creativity is an absolute tool in the toolkit. So I'll ask you one last question, and then I'll definitely let you go. I apologize. I've asked you a ton already, but
That's
one of
fun.
the things I really appreciate that we've been able to do in this series is we're talking with senior leaders. We're talking with folks of a certain vintage, is the nicest way I can put it for people of my age. And what I love about that is we've seen things change, and we get to look at the long view of things. And I'd be really interested in the last question I'd like to ask everybody is, as you look at the future of cybersecurity, where we're going, the next 20 years, the next 30 years, based on what you've experienced in your career to this point, are you optimistic or pessimistic about where we're going?
Oh, I'm totally optimistic. So I hang around with a lot of innovative CEOs who are in cyber, who are creating just amazing platforms. And I think we're all going to be giving these cyber criminals a run for their money. And the technology just keeps getting better and better. AI is not something that, we need to be afraid of. We can embrace it because it's going to help. Now, on the flip side, the cyber criminals have it too and using it to their advantage. But the technology is just getting so much better and so more refined. So I'm excited about the future.
I agree. I see nothing but good things ahead. I see lots of problems, lots of challenges, but that's really, to me, the neat part of this. And I think, in my own experience, there's just more people working this with more talent than we've ever had. And I'm excited about that. Well,
Me too.
Sue, again, I could keep asking you questions all day long. I'll force myself to stop. Thank you for joining us, Sue. This has been incredibly insightful, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me, Steve. I really had fun. So thank you again.
Anytime, anytime, Sue.